something that's been really helpful for me and something that I tell people a lot is to really focus on like small everyday things over like big dramatic like actions, like and this has been something that my church has been really great about emphasizing is think about where you already are and what you're already doing and how can you invite people into that.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name is Darius.
And guys, go check us out on all the social medias. We're finally on Facebook after 3 years. It's very sparsely because it's Facebook. We're on Instagram and TikTok, YouTube. We got a Patreon. You guys know all this stuff.
Leave a review too. Reviews help a lot.
Reviews help a lot.
Especially Spotify.
Yeah, write very nice reviews. If you want to write a bad review,
or just rate us.
You can go to any other podcast and leave a bad review, but not this one. It's not very kind.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that, let's get into the show.
Yeah, so today we have an awesome guest. She's a singleness coach. Her name is MaryB Safrit. MaryB, is there anything you'd like to plug for yourself?
Oh, yeah, I have some really fun stuff coming up where I have my own podcast. It's called Unsuitable with MaryB Safrit. I interview single Christians to broaden the conversation on singleness in the church. Our new season 9, is going to drop February the 21st. Very excited. It's going to be all about purity culture and sexuality. And so we've got some really awesome guests lined up, going to be very nuanced, going to come at it from a lot of angles. Really excited. And then I also have a free Valentine's Day board game that I'm going to release on February the 2nd. So follow me on Instagram or TikTok, sign up for my newsletter, and you'll be the first to know about all of that when it drops.
There you go.
So I'm
awesome.
MaryB.Safrit on Instagram and TikTok, and my website's MaryBSafrit.com. So very exciting stuff coming up. That's going to be a lot of fun.
And where can people listen to your podcast?
Oh, anywhere that you get podcasts.
There you
Spotify, Apple, all of the places. Yeah, we try to be as broad with our distribution as possible.
Cool. I know some people decide to take it off all those and just put it on their website or something like that, which I never really understood, but thought I'd just make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. Yes, we are all the usual places.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Have you thought about getting on Rumble before?
No, I don't know if I know what Rumble is.
It's like this up and coming. It's trying to challenge YouTube because YouTube's like the giant of the video space.
We're not on there. Yeah.
We're not, but I've
Gotcha.
heard of different podcasts that have gone on there, and I thought maybe we should be on there because usually it's the people who are it's like, you know what Parler is? It's like the Facebook for conservatives. Rumble's kind of like that, where it's almost like video space for people who get demonetized on YouTube. But I just always was thinking man, that might be a good thing to be wide or distributed wide. But I thought there's probably not that many people on there. There's 1 billion people on YouTube. It's not a lack of audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess it all depends on where your people are, and if your people are there, then worth it. But I don't know that my people would necessarily be there. I should say that we are not on YouTube. Unsuitable is not on YouTube, but Spotify, Apple, all of that. Just because we do not a ton of editing, but enough that it would be very challenging to get the video all synced up and whatnot. So we're not at that point quite yet, but
understand
maybe
that
one day.
Yeah, cool. So MaryB, can you tell us what a singleness coach is, maybe for people who don't know? Me and Ethan were kind of joking about it before because we don't really necessarily know what it is, but we thought it'd be funny if a singleness coach was somebody that someone commits to this person of I'm gonna be single, don't let me ever get in a relationship, and you do everything you can to sabotage their life so they can never get in a relationship. Give them terrible advice, and every time they go on a date, it's your job to ruin it or something. They're just chronically in bad relationships. So it's your job to keep them single until they heal or something.
I have a bad history with the people I choose to date. You're okay, well, I'll show up to every date you're on and I'll just ruin it. I'll either be hey, aren't you the guy who kicked the puppy in the park last week? Or
that was you.
No, it really was. I have a video.
So funny.
But yeah, so what does
we know that it's not that. So not to demean you. But
she's
no, totally fine. I was gonna make a joke about it being a sobriety coach, except for dating. where I'm just, I mean, honestly, if that's what it was, I could see myself being pretty good at that. Just because I like to, live my life doing all of these bits all of the time. And that just feels like it'd be a super fun bit. And I get to like try out different characters and improv. So that's not a bad idea. That is not exactly what I do though. I coach singles who are Christian, who are trying to figure out how to do both faithfully and, are really looking to make the most of their right now lives and really step into what God is inviting them into in their current context, whether they're going to get married in the future or not. It's really about, like, how do I build holistically speaking, how do I build healthy relationships? We talk a lot about like people who need to, who are recovering from purity culture. And so working through some of that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not a therapist, but so it's more like vision casting for the future versus digging up stuff from the past is kind of how I would qualify the difference there. But also if someone like wants to make a career change or is like, I'm moving to a new place and I just want someone to help me like brainstorm how to like create community. There's a lot of different stuff that we talk about. I don't like if someone wanted to hire me as more of a dating coach, I could definitely do that. But it's more kind of the like 90% that comprises the rest of singles' lives that we work with, as opposed to just focusing in on dating. So
gotcha.
That's a little snapshot of what I do.
Yeah. Do you have a lot of people who are like, hey, I'm choosing to be single and live single intentionally for like celibate my life? And is that some of the people that you are working with?
I would say for me, it's more so people who like find themselves single and are kind of wrestling with the potential of like, this might be me for the rest of my life. Like I don't have a ton of control over whether or not I'm going to get married. And so, they're not necessarily, some are like, I'm okay with that. And like, I'm coming to terms with that, but I just need a little help, like vision casting, because there aren't a ton of models for like what that looks like for what, my life could look like in a church context. There just isn't the support necessarily for people who are in that situation. So it's more people who happen to find themselves single. And so I would say that like, it's more people in their 30s and a little bit older. I find that singles who are maybe more in the early 20s space tend to be, this is a broad generalization, but are more in the like place of, I just want to get unsingle as quickly as possible. Right. And like marriage is for sure going to happen for me. There's a kind of a threshold where I find that people, especially women, get to a point where they're like, oh, right, this is not a guarantee. What is my life going to look like? What is like the hope for me and my, like, what does it look like to build a full, meaningful, faithful life as a person who is single long term? So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So those are some deep things to wrestle through too.
Yeah. And I know like that's not got to be an easy road to walk either after, because like I was thinking like, young 20s are probably like they're just finding their footing. They're just either graduating college or getting started in their career. But once you've been maybe living your life for a while and settled into your career and those questions start coming up, that it's great to have a place to turn to and kind of soundboard off and have another person to talk to about all that stuff. How long have you been a singleness coach?
So I've been a coach for 3 years now. I've changed the phrasing around a little bit, but I've just started using the terminology, the language of a singles coach in the last year or so. Just because I wrestled with like relationship coach or life coach, and singles coach felt the most right to describe what I'm doing, because it's not necessarily specifically about relationship, and there's also the connotation, if you're a relationship coach, you're going to be like coaching people with dating. Right. So I would say from a vocabulary linguistic perspective, it's been about a year, but I've been a coach, one-on-one coach for a few years now.
How did you identify the certain problems that you now cover within your coaching?
Yeah, I started like really digging into this niche probably 5 years ago. And so it started because I had an idea for a book and really saw a void in the Christian market in particular when it comes to books that are for singles that aren't necessarily about getting unsingle as quickly as possible, that aren't, and also that are like written by actual single people and that are like not necessarily coming from a place of marriage is a guarantee or like you just need to be content and like forcing people kind of through that process without any nuance or depth. So yeah, I became really fascinated by the topic and by the lack of resources for single people because I am single myself and it's not necessarily something that I sought out, but I think it was because I had this idea in my head of what resources for singles would be about, and it would mostly be about here's how to prepare yourself for marriage, which is not the path that I was really on at the time. Always have been very much like excited by like creative work and like being open to following wherever the Lord calls me. I've done some missions work. I've gone to grad school. I like moved to New York. So I feel I was always a lot more excited about that path than the marriage path. So I think, yeah, I from there started just having more open conversations with people who are actually single and Christian. Moving to New York was a huge part of that as well, I will say, because it's just a lot more normalized here to be single, quote unquote, later in life, whatever that means. But yeah, so I just found myself in a culture that was very different from, growing up in the southeastern United States. It's very much more so like, just marriage is so much more normalized, and that's just like kind of the given thing that you're gonna do. Yeah, so like having these really open, honest conversations, looking into what kind of resources are out there and like where my personal frustration was with those resources, and just kind of putting stuff out there, building my Instagram. I have a blog as well, and then the podcast. Having a ton of conversations with people and seeing like it was kind of this moment of I can't be the only one who feels this way. I can't be the only one who's frustrated by this. I can't be the only one who is really hungry for a different conversation on singleness, and I wasn't. So it's been really cool to discover that, and to over the past 5 years just really like listen to what people are saying, what the questions that people are asking, getting to work with different kinds of people, getting to talk to a pretty broad range of humans on my podcast. I think it's all come from just a combination of all of those things, and then just giving myself the time and space to think and pray and meditate and research very deeply on this topic.
Wow. Have you seen the landscape of what it's like to be single increase in like its positivity in the last 3 years since you've been starting, or I guess let's 5 years since you've been studying it, from where we were to where we are now? Like, are people more accepting of people being single, or even the idea of not everybody's gonna get married in their lifetime, or is it kind of the same?
I mean, it seems to be shifting a little bit, just as far as at least the fact that more people seem to be talking about it more. And I don't know if that's just like because I am paying more attention in a very particular way, but I do find that there seems to be greater recognition, at least within the general Christian cultural zeitgeist, of like this reality that there are so many single people in the church, and what are we gonna do with that information? What are we gonna do about that information? Why is this happening? And people have all sorts of theories about that. But yeah, I would say that I think that there is kind of a critical mass as far as singles go that is making the conversation feel more urgent. Because I think just so many people who are in leadership, who are like thought leaders even in the Christian space, are married. And so the reality of singleness, of being a single Christian, is just like can be pretty separate from pretty isolated from the conversations that are happening in the rooms where decisions are being made. And so there's just kind of that, I mean, it's human nature to not necessarily be able to think outside of, not even words, like to not necessarily know what questions even we need to be asking, or not have a particular perspective or lens or way of being able to see this is a very real problem, and maybe we're not addressing it in a way that is helpful for those people, or like helpful for the church as a whole. Was that coherent at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in your experience with coaching different people and, running a podcast, I'm sure you interact with a lot of single people, whether you're directly coaching them or maybe they're reaching out to you. What is the biggest or most common question that people wrestle through when they are talking to you? And then following that up, how do you answer them?
Yeah, I think conversation that I have a lot with a lot of people is really about I don't know, this disconnect between what how do I want to phrase this? I think what I find is that singles really want very real, deep, thick community, and are having a lot of trouble being met in that need by the church, by the communities that they're in, because it's at least Western white American culture is pretty isolated and pretty insular as far as nuclear families. And so, there's really that desire to be kind of part of a larger group and context outside of their own household, that I think is a pretty consistent struggle that I hear from singles, where they don't necessarily want a whole singles ministry or whatever. They just want to figure out how to really invite people into their lives and be invited into people's lives in this really interconnected, interdependent way. That is really what we see, in scripture when we look at the early church. And so there's that real hunger for that. And so they're wondering, how do I do that when I'm not necessarily being met in that? And how do I really, how do I communicate with my church leaders? How do I explain what it is that I want, what it is that is needed here? And, how do I talk to my married friends and ask for what I need? How do I set boundaries with, how much I'm serving at church, so that I'm not overextending myself for the sake of feeling this sense of thick community. A lot of stuff like that. I would say real community is a big thing that we talk about quite a bit.
Do you find that overextension of the individual happens a lot when people are searching for that deeper community?
I would say so. There's definitely, this is something I talk about a lot, even with my friends who are single. This sense that, especially if you're single, but I think it's probably true for a lot of people in a lot of different life life circumstances, that if you're not like volunteering out the yin yang, then there's not necessarily that feeling of connection or visibility with the church. And so it kind of becomes this question of, is my value in this community contingent on my usefulness? And I think like there's also a perception that singles have so much more time, and so they should be serving, like every free moment that they have should be given to the church, and they should be serving in X, Y, and Z capacities. And so I think like there's a few different components there that kind of lead to this pressure to overcommit, overextend ourselves.
And so how do you respond to people when they say like, yeah, I have this deep longing for real community? And yeah, what is in your opinion, the solution to that?
Not a small question at all. Solve all of our problems.
Let me give you the 5 points of how to make real community. No, I think like something that's been really helpful for me, and something that I tell people a lot, is to really focus on like small everyday things over like big dramatic like actions, like and this has been something that my church has been really great about emphasizing, is think about where you already are and what you're already doing, and how can you invite people into that versus having to create a whole new thing. Like everybody eats, everyone has to do laundry, everyone has to do all of these things. Can you invite somebody into that? Or like you're connected to people just by the nature of being a person in the world. You have your building that you live in, or your neighborhood that you live in. You have your church that you go to. You have your workplace. And so like, what are the little moments in any of those areas where you can just kind of be a little bit more intentional in the questions that you're asking and how you're engaging with each other, or how you're spending your meal time, or, how you're like where you're serving, and the kinds of conversations that you're having. So like, I play trivia with some friends on a Monday night, and a couple of them are friends from church, a couple are friends from college. But that's just a thing that we set up like
that sounds
a couple years ago to kind of it's super fun, but just to like have it in the schedule. So it's just kind of, there isn't that extra level of bandwidth required to like try and coordinate everyone's schedules and try to figure out when you're available and whatever. That can be like a pretty big mental hurdle. Or even like worrying about, am I bothering them by reaching out to them? Like even that more like, I don't know, insecure, vulnerable, like human side of it. So just to find ways to put those little things into your schedule, or like figure out where in your schedule you can fold people in. I think in very small, sustainable ways has been really huge for me. And it's something that I'm always telling people and inviting people to do.
Now, I don't want to sound like I kind of arrogant or so I'm kind of saying this in a cheeky sense.
I'm going to.
Maybe. But I'm a huge extrovert. So I would think that if I was in this situation, I would try to call a number of my closest friends and be like, guys, let's just all get a house together and be roommates so we're always together. Is that a fair response, or is that like an ignorant response, like a response without knowledge?
No, I think that's definitely a thing that people do. There's, especially, I mean, here in New York City, like, oh my gosh. I mean, housing everywhere is ridiculous right now, but like here it's just always ridiculous and expensive. So there's some very creative living situations for sure. And I think that, like personally, I live by myself, but that's definitely, I'm also introverted though. So I do like having my space. But yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing. I think also like housing instability is a whole issue with singles as well. Just as far as like the having only one income and like also, not necessarily being in a solid financial place to buy all the time. Just, and like, if you're living with roommates, then there's you don't have any sort of guarantee that they're going to want to be your roommate for any extended period of time. So you're having to like find a new roommate and stuff like that. So if, I think that's a great idea and a great solution. I also like think that having a conversation up front about, hey, what is the like commitment here and what is the expectation as far as like how long we would be in this situation, like just being very clear about that kind of thing, because there is that I guess baggage of relational uncertainty that I think a lot of singles would be bringing into that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we've seen that in different contexts. What part of our jobs that we get a bunch of students who come through, and so you get to know people really well for like 6 months, and then you never see them again. And so after like doing that for a little bit, it's almost hard sometimes to be like, I'm really gonna pour myself out and get to know you, because it's like, well, yeah, I could, but there's also Derry's gonna be here for 4 years, and that's a lot more stable. Just an example. But did you happen to listen to the episode we did with Peter Valk? Is that his last name? Peter Valk?
I did not, but I have had him as a guest on my podcast, and I love Peter. Yeah.
I was going to ask if you were familiar, because he kind of had a similar solution to what I brought up, but more of a deeper commitment of like, hey, we are committed to like staying here for a long time and having that friendship. And so it's like a number of them. And that's kind of where I was thinking about. I was like, that would sound super fun if I was in this situation.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think like Peter's doing some really, really interesting things and like really pushing the envelope, really asking a lot of really important, really great questions. So I'm a huge fan of Peter's. But yeah, I think it even brings up the question of like, what kinds of commitment conversations can I have with people who are friends versus, and what is the expectation that we have there, and is our view of friendship so low that we don't think that we can even bring that up, that it's asking too much of a friend to commit to like 2 years or 3 years, and recognizing that life happens and blah blah blah, but even just
what's up, guys? So we had a quick little interruption. Computers and technology. So we're just going to get right back into it. We're finishing off talking about the commitment level of friendship and how sometimes you don't have that vulnerability, or how do you? And you were saying like, do we view friendship so low that we can't ask for long-term commitment? Yeah. And so do you just want to finish off some of that stuff, and then Derry will have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I think personally, even thinking about having those kinds of conversations feels a little scary. But I think it's at least worth asking, and at least worth broaching and examining our own assumptions about what friendship is. Because if we look at how Jesus talks about friendship, it's pretty revolutionary. He talks about how greater love has no one than this, than to lay their friend. And Jesus, we see Jesus like really investing in these friendships that he has with the disciples, with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, with all of these people that he really is able to pour into in a really significant way. And even like the way that Jesus talks about his relationships with them, he says, "I've called you friends, not servants." And so I think like really deepening our, like really allowing the Lord to broaden our imagination for what friendship is and the role that it can play in our lives, especially as Christians. I think like there's a really incredible opportunity there for the entire church. And I really think that singles like feel that need in a very urgent way. That is a really cool opportunity for like, I don't know, I think it could be pretty revolutionary for our communities, and especially with like loneliness being such an epidemic, not just for single people, but for everybody. It really like, it's such a human thing that this like deep need for community, even just like, I mean, one person can't be all of that, and God didn't create us to be just isolated individuals. And so I think there's just like we're at a really cool moment where, like, I think if singles were kind of brought to the forefront of that conversation, and especially like I think LGBTQ celibate singles have a really unique and awesome perspective on this as well. There's just we're at a cool moment where that could be like very revolutionary and very transformative for the church, and really meet a deep cultural need at the same time.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, I think our cultures have definitely devolved away from the family aspect so much, even in just our communities, how we used to live so much closer to each other. And now we have friends that live miles apart, and, we have cars and stuff to get to see them. But, we've definitely separated a lot. So this aspect seems extreme of like asking friends to commit to you, where there's usually like an unspoken commitment that happens within how much you share with someone, and an unspoken vulnerability and intimacy that you have that kind of creates an unspoken bond. But having like a verbal bond between somebody, it seems extreme, but it seems like that's where the solution kind of lies within a lot of our cultured problems or holes that we have with people who don't have those kind of communities. Have you seen people in your life apply this at all? Like actually speaking out and verbalizing that kind of commitment, or not really?
I think that what I've experienced more so is, I've heard this from a couple of different podcast guests, but actually someone said this to me when, two of my friends started dating, and it was awesome, amazing, really great. They're married now, fantastic humans. But just that like moment of relational shift caused like some uncertainty for me that I didn't even know like how to address, or how to like, it was just something that I didn't have like language for at the time. This was like several years ago. And just got coffee with one of them, and he was like, this isn't going to change anything. Like, we love you, and we're like your friends, and we're like going to be like, we're not going anywhere. And that was a super powerful moment. And so I've tried to kind of carry that with me. And there've been a few moments where I've been able to say that to different friends who seem to be expressing like that same anxiety and uncertainty about like shifts in our friendship, or just shifts in their lives, where they're noticing like friends kind of ghosting them or whatever. Just to have those little moments where I've had a few moments where I see that opportunity, and I only say it if I mean it. It's not something that I'm just gonna like say, but to just really take that opportunity to say, hey, I'm not going anywhere. Like, I'm committed to this friendship, and I really care about you, and I really value you as a friend, and I love that you're part of my life. So like that's more the case for me and what I've seen and experienced, versus like, okay, let us sign a friendship contract that we are going to be part of each other's lives for the next,
right,
however many years. It's reiteration that, again, it's pretty, I don't know, it would be pretty vulnerable, I think, to even ask for that reassurance. But, if we can kind of look for those little moments to just, I don't know, affirm the friendship, affirm a person's value in our lives, and affirm like our love for them, in a way that's like very natural and organic, and it doesn't have to be a whole big thing. It's just like, hey, I just want to tell you that you're important to me. And like, I have some friends who are having a baby, and I was like, hey, I know that I am not the best with kids. And I say that frequently, but like, I want to be part of your kid's life, and I want to like really be part of your family, and because we're like really great friends. And so like, whatever you need, like, I really don't want you to hesitate to ask. And I'm planning to like come over and help out and all of that. So yeah, just like looking for those little moments to affirm the friendship, especially in times of transition, where it's like, hey, I don't know how this is going to change things, but I want you to know that like, I'm committed to like figuring it out with you.
Wow, that's good. Have you seen a lot of people, either of your friends or people that you coach, deal with the same kind of problems when it comes to people getting married or friends moving away or even friends that are already married having kids and a lot of that stress come up? Do you see that often?
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's a ton of that. I mean, like, even if I don't even know how many times it's happened to me or people I know, like where your friend starts dating someone even, and they just like completely vanish because they're just 100% in that relationship, which is like part of that is normal and
could be codependent
human.
too.
It's just very human. It could be. Yeah. I think it's very healthy to have like a whole community around you in those situations. But I think like there's so many times when, especially when a friend gets married, like there's a real sense of mourning that I think a lot of singles experience, or a real grief, because so many times, right, it's like they enter into married people land, and they're like your life your like common experience. What is the phrase I'm looking for? I don't even know. But your shared experience as far as, your life paths are diverging there. And so just as far as commonality, they're very naturally going to have a lot more in common with, and those like unspoken realities that come along with being married, right? That's what they're going to have in common with other people who are married. And so your realities are like going to become more and more different from each other as long as that person stays single. And so there's kind of that very human thing that wants to connect with people who are in those kind of similar situations. And I'm not saying that like you shouldn't. Married people should have married friends. But, for a lot of people, there's been a lot of times where a friend gets married and basically they forget their single friends. They forget what it's like to be single. And they're off in married world and doing all the married people things and hanging out with their couple friends. And it's a huge source of grief, I think, for a lot of people. And so even when friends start dating someone, or friends get engaged, or friends get married, there's that extra level of like fear and anxiety because it's happened in the past. And so you're like really not sure, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? And that's a great opportunity for communication as well.
Do you think that this divide that kind of happens, and I've seen this a lot, when what you just reiterated, with people when they get married, they kind of go off and sit in like married person land, and they have their married friends now that they hang out with, maybe because they have more in common. But do you think that this is more of a problem that speaks to how individualistic our lives are now, to where we don't include different kinds of people within our like friendship spheres? Where it used to be like, yeah, this older couple is here, and then this guy who's single is also here, and like all these different people are part of my community. Now it's much more like people my age and of my like status hang out together, and then when that status changes, or when that subgroup or subculture changes, we go and hang out with a different kind of group that we can like feel comfortable with, and it's not segregated at all, really. Do you think it's more of that kind of a problem, or where is your sort of evaluation of the problem there?
Yeah, I saw a tweet a while ago that's like just lived rent free in my head ever since. I think it was Katie Boyd, I think is her name. And she's talking about community and this segmentation that happens very naturally. And she said, gosh, I'm going to butcher it, but basically she said, that happens because we think that what we need is commiseration when what we need is collaboration. And so it's this like, I don't know. I think like it's definitely easier in some ways to hang out with people who get you and who get your life and who like can commiserate with you and, or like just have wisdom about your, what you're going through. Like, oh, my kid's doing this. Oh yeah, my kid was just doing that. And, I don't know. That was a bad example because I don't know very much about children, but, but I think like, and there's definitely a need for that. But yeah, this kind of segmentation, I think, I don't know. I think like we feel like maybe there's a part of us that thinks like, again, that sense of sameness is what we need and want, when really like that difference and that like outside perspective is really like enriching and really healthy even.
Yeah.
And I do feel like there is a sense that, like we're not, there's a whole thing that a discourse that I've kind of been part of or heard on TikTok about like third spaces, where you have like your home and your work, but there aren't necessarily, besides like restaurants and bars and stuff, like these third spaces where people just kind of hang out. Like in a, at college, you would have like, I don't know, the quad or the tons of spaces where people just go and hang out. And that's like such an important part of building community, is having those spaces where people are hanging out. And, once you kind of leave college, culturally, we just don't necessarily have those in the same way. You can have these like, I don't know, like sports teams or like trivia teams or whatever, but there's a lot of those that revolve around spending money or, whatever. So, there isn't necessarily that, I don't know, underlying like infrastructure to support that kind of community building that can make it really challenging. And I think church in a lot of ways is that third space for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But, there's definitely a lot of room for growth in how that particular kind of third space is set up and how it does and doesn't facilitate that kind of collaborative, thick community. And how it like maybe reinforces this insular nuclear family unit kind of model that is a cultural thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully said. I love it. Collaboration.
Thanks.
And that, like you said, that reinforces people to have more of that familial model that we miss so much. And I think a lot of people would just say this is opinion, but I think it's generally true that that's the kind of thing that we need, where a lot of couples will just isolate themselves after they get either dating or they get married, and they completely change their lives. And it does, in my opinion, unfairly disrupt a lot of other things in people's lives that they were counting on for their community and stuff like that. And it's so easy to do now that you don't necessarily move. Like maybe one person moves, but like you're not like out of town now, but you've moved relationally from so many people, and it just becomes so different. And it is a disruption in ways that can be harmful for some people. But there's a lot of people who will do relationships correctly and don't just isolate themselves from their friends' lives or whatever, become different people after they get in relationships. And we can definitely learn a lot from those kinds of people, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So at the end, we started talking about the church there. And I know the church and church culture affects so much of this sphere that we're kind of talking about. What are the things you think that the church gets wrong about being single, singleness? Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I'm sure like a lot of people that you counsel are sort of in that realm or that sphere. So what are the areas that you think the church sort of misses or doesn't talk about or gets wrong when it comes to being single?
I mean, how long do you have? I don't want to, just poo-poo on the church. I love the church. I'm a huge fan of the church. I think I think a lot that the church gets wrong. I think that, there just isn't like dialogue necessarily between singles and married folks, or singles and church leadership, especially single women. And that has, there's a lot of different things we can point to as to why that is, purity culture, not least of which, just in the perception of single women. And I think, that disconnect, I think, is a huge pain point and a huge thing that we kind of all get wrong when it comes to talking about singleness, is that just singles aren't involved in the conversation in a substantial, meaningful way. And so there's maybe a disconnect between what like if anything is being offered, what is being offered and how it's being offered. I think so there's that disconnect that could be addressed through representation, like married people who know single people, like really using that privilege to advocate for their single friends and nominate them for leadership positions. But I also think I don't know, there's a lot of deeper assumptions that are kind of really challenging to for single people to I don't know, work against. I think there's a lot of perceptions that if you're single for a long period of time, still there's something wrong with you. You're single because I don't know, you have a collection of porcelain dolls, you know what I mean? That there has to be something wrong with you that is making you single.
Right.
And so there's the assumption that marriage is the ultimate end all be all goal for a person's life and God's will for everyone and God's best plan for everyone. That's not necessarily something that everybody would say, but when you hear singles being spoken to or counseled, just being asked about their dating life before they're asked about anything else, or given these platitudes about how to find a spouse, or really focusing in on that one area of their life versus being treated as a whole person with a whole series, a whole life and history and series of interests and callings. So I think that is a big thing as well, just these underlying assumptions that we're really going to have to do a lot of work to unearth and really refocus back on, Christ, who is the foundation, the bedrock of the author and perfecter of our faith. And I think again, I mentioned this earlier, but really seeing singles as a valuable part of the community as they are where they are, versus being seen, their value being kind of tied up in their usefulness or marriageability. So what is it, what is the perception of singles as, what is their inherent value? How do singles embody the gospel in a very particular way that is super valuable to this community? What are the questions that single Christians are asking with their lives that the church can learn from, that the church can really, that God is offering us as a way to expand our understanding of who God is and who Jesus is and what this life of faith can look like, and what kinds of relationships we were created for and how we live that out, and how that teaches us, it shows us a broader picture of who God is. I think those are just a few things that come to mind.
That's great. Yeah,
awesome stuff.
One last question that I had about more of the biblical aspect of everything we're talking about in singleness. What would your response be? I have some ideas too, but what would your response be to someone that would be listening to this conversation and they would say, well, this is all fine and good, but what's the point? Shouldn't biblically someone be searching for a significant other so that they can get married and have kids? Isn't that a biblical model that we should be following every time for every person? What would you say to someone who has that perspective on what the Bible says about marriage, life, community?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask for receipts on that, just to say where do you see that as the biblical model? And I'm not saying that it's not there. I just would be curious to hear, to follow that logic and train of thought, because it definitely is one. But I mean, I don't know. There's so many things that you could point to, the life of Jesus, number one. But even if we follow the overall story arc of Scripture, there's definitely a lot of emphasis, I would say, in the Old Testament on biological family procreation, building God's kingdom through biological procreation. But we do see a marked shift in the New Testament, with how Jesus talks about family and how Jesus talks about making disciples, right? How Jesus talks about multiplication, how Jesus talks about, like, I have it written down here. Like there's a moment when Jesus is preaching or teaching, and his mom and brothers, come and are like, "Hey, we want to talk to you." And Jesus is like, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Anyone who does the will of my Father, that's my mother, that's my sister, that's my brother. And then, even looking at the language of being born again into the family of God through being born again by water and the Spirit, I think there's a really strong shift that we can see, or at least a lot of places where Jesus at least challenges our concept of this supremacy of the biological family, and says it's so much bigger than that. Like when we're born again, when we become, well, he obviously doesn't say when we become Christians, but when we were born again, we have this tie and we have this bond with one another that is so much deeper than blood and biology, and it's so much more eternal than blood and biology, or even like a marriage contract. That there is a home and there is a place for anybody here, whether you're married, whether you're single, that God's promises are for everyone. And we really see Jesus modeling that in a really beautiful and a really profound way, and really challenging this idea that there is one way to get to, that there is one life path that would lead us to God, that would lead us to himself. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Now, I would say that the Bible isn't in favor either or of which direction. I think that it's pretty neutral and has advice to singles and married. Yeah. But to play devil's advocate to what's the biblical narrative for that? I was just thinking, what would someone say? I would wonder if they would point to the fact that Jesus created humanity in a marriage context and told them to multiply and take over the world. Now, maybe it was only that because they needed to multiply. But the first picture of humanity you see would be a covenantal marriage. And then the final picture that you see in the Bible is a marriage with Jesus and his church, the bride, And so I'd wonder, I know that if someone could point to that, and if they did, what would be your response?
Yeah, I think totally legit. Be fruitful, multiply, all of that jazz. Creation mandate, solid. I think I don't know how I read it. I kind of see first, I don't think that I don't read it's not good for man to be alone as being specific to
marriage context.
I don't think that marriage is the prescription for that for everyone. I think that it's actually a much broader picture that we ultimately get as far as what it means that man should not be alone. But I also think that there's a really interesting parallel that I kind of make, or at least connection that I make between this creation mandate and the Great Commission, where Jesus says to go and make disciples of all nations, which is a type of multiplication, right? That to me, I think we can look back and think our goal is to get back to this Edenic picture of the world, or how is Jesus handing us this expanded view of where we are headed and what we were ultimately created for, which is this union of us and him. And so to me, I think the Great Commission is this really beautiful broadening and inclusive picture of what it means to fulfill that specific component of the creation mandate, which plenty of we see several examples in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically, of people who like Jesus and Paul and a lot of these early church leaders who it would be very hard to say that they were not fruitful and did not multiply, because they are the reason that we have a church. And so that, like, I think to me, it's kind of a shifting of focus to what this new heaven and this new earth that we are going towards. What does that look like? And like, yes, there is that imagery of the union between Jesus and the church, but that's not between us as human beings, right? That's like the ultimate, like marriage to me is a signpost to that ultimate union that we're going to have. And so I think, like, once we have the actual thing, why would we want or need the signpost? We have the actual union, the actual thing that it was kind of pointing us towards all along. So that's kind of how I think about it. Like, okay, yes, and yes, this is how we were created. This is the narrative, and this is the model. And also, like, what does the life of Jesus? Jesus was not. If Jesus was the perfect man who lived a perfect life, and he didn't fulfill that specific interpretation of the creation mandate, what does that tell us? What does that kind of invite us? Like, how might that shift our thinking and the way that we're picturing what we're ultimately headed for as believers?
Yeah. It's interesting because, he didn't have, like, an earthly wife, but he definitely has, like I said, like that bride, like us. We are technically his wife. So he has that relational component, but not in a, like, human ministry. But even so, like, Paul, and I have 1 Corinthians pulled up, 1 Corinthians 7, Paul's all about, like, hey, if you are married, don't seek to be unmarried. If you're not married, don't worry about it. If you're not married, you have full devotion to the Lord, and you can 100% focus on serving the Lord. And he's like, if you're not, your interests are divided. But along with that, he says, if you marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. And I find it hilarious that Paul's like, listen, if you get married, go for it.
You're going to have lots of drama.
But go for it. I just think it's hilarious. But yeah, I think the New Testament's pretty clear that it's neither here nor there. Like, none is higher than the other. Our value is not dependent upon our marital status. Our value is dependent on who we are as God's creation. And that is divinely given to us and cannot be taken away by any means of marital status.
Also, when we're perfect in the kingdom, we won't be given in marriage either.
Except to Jesus.
Right. You see the shift in that.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we like to ask our guests one last question when they're on the show. We created the show for the reason of helping people with their questions, things you don't hear in church, answering the gray areas of the Christian faith. So the thing we like to ask everybody before they go, I know it's off topic and it's a big question, but we like to ask people, what is the thing that has been the hardest thing you've gone through in your faith, whether it's caused you to doubt your faith or it's just been hard to go through, that other people might also struggle with? It can be a question or an experience or something that you went through and you're still a Christian after it. Maybe you found an answer, maybe you haven't found an answer, but do you have something that you want to share with us or share with the audience?
Yeah. I've gone through a couple of bouts of pretty serious depression in my life. The first time, it was my faith was really sustaining through it, and God really met me in it in a very. The second time around, it was a little drier spiritually, and I was also going through a lot of just transitions. It was like shortly after I moved here, career-wise, was making a huge shift, and was just feeling really listless. I was also in therapy. And was asking a lot of unearthing a lot about myself and my past. And so just had this moment, several moments where I was just questioning all of it. I don't know, I've never doubted that God exists or anything like that. I think I've just mostly been like, are you good or are you kind of a hole? So there was very profound moment where I was like, I don't my picture of God is so tied up in all of these different filters that I have based on these relationships from my past and relationships in my life. And so I don't even know who God is anymore or what like these basic concepts of faith mean for my life. And I would say what has sustained me through that, I should say, was like I was still like really involved in my church and my community and like building those relationships. And I would say that like finding safe people who are Christians to talk to about that stuff and to ask those who were like very receptive to those big questions and didn't try to answer them, just like wanted to know me and love me through them. And like, I don't know, I've really learned a lot about the faithfulness of Jesus through the faithfulness of these friends who have really met me, in that time when it was a pretty dark time in my life. So, yeah.
Wow, thanks for sharing.
That's really awesome.
That's great.
I'm sure that like a lot of people can relate to those seasons. That's going to really reach and encourage a lot of people. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we take off, if you want to point people in the direction of your social medias again, your podcast, just another reminder, we'll put it all in the description below so people can find you as well.
Absolutely. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at MaryB.Safrit. My website is MaryBSafrit.com, and I've got some fun freebies there for folks. And then you can get my book, The Single Christian Church Survival Guide, on Amazon. And my podcast is Unsuitable with MaryB Safrit, and you can get that. You can listen to that wherever you get podcasts. And if you get podcasts somewhere that we aren't, please reach out and let us know, and we will happily fix that for you.
Sounds good. All right, guys. Check out all her content. It's below. Just click all those links, and we will see you next week.